Welcome back. This is the second video for Lecture 3. I fixed the screen, so it should be better now. We already started talking about Moses, but I wanted to play the Bible Project video that looks at Exodus, the literary structure of it, and some of the main themes that'll help us get into our discussion of Exodus.
The book of Exodus. It's the second book of the Bible, and it picks up the storyline from the previous book, Genesis, which ended with Abraham's grandson, Jacob, leading his large family of 70 people down to Egypt. Now, Jacob's 11th son, Joseph, had been elevated to second in command over Egypt, and he had saved his whole family in the famine. And so Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, offered the family to come live there as a safe haven. And so eventually Jacob dies there in Egypt, and Joseph and all his brothers do. About 400 years pass, and the story of the Exodus begins. Now that name refers to the event that takes place in the first half of the book, Israel's exodus from Egypt. But the book has a second half that takes place at the foot of Mount Sinai. In this video, we'll just focus on the first half, where centuries had passed, and the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied, and they filled the land. Now, this line is a deliberate echo back to the blessing that God gave all humanity back in the Garden of Eden. And it reminds us of the big biblical story so far. Humanity forfeited God's blessing through sin and rebellion, and so God chose Abraham's family as the vehicle through which he would restore his blessing to all the world. But the new Pharaoh does not view Israel as a blessing. He actually thinks this growing Israelite immigrant group is a threat to his power. And so just as in Genesis, humanity rebels against God's blessing, so here Pharaoh attempts to destroy the source of God's blessing, the Israelites. He brutally enslaves them in forced labor, and then he orders that all the Israelite boys be drowned in the Nile River. Now Pharaoh, he is the worst character in the Bible so far. His kingdom epitomizes humanity's rebellion against God. Pharaoh has so redefined good and evil according to his own interests that even the murder of innocent children has become good. And so Egypt has become worse than Babylon from the book of Genesis. And so now Israel cries out for help against this new Babylon, and God responds. God first turns Pharaoh's evil upside down as an Israelite mother throws her boy into the Nile River, but in a basket. And so he floats safely right down into Pharaoh's own family. He's named Moses, and he grows up to eventually become the man that God will use to defeat Pharaoh's evil. In the famous story of the burning bush, God appears to Moses and commissions him to go to Pharaoh and order him to release the Israelites. And God says that he knows Pharaoh will resist, and so he will bring his judgment on Egypt in the form of plagues. Then God also says that he will harden Pharaoh's heart. And so we're introduced into the next main part of the story, the confrontation between God and Pharaoh. Now, what does this mean that God says he'll harden Pharaoh's heart? It's super important to read this section of the story really closely in sequence. In Moses and Pharaoh's first encounter, we're told simply that Pharaoh's heart grew hard. There's no implication that God did anything. And so in response, God sends the first set of 5 plagues, each one confronting Pharaoh and one of his Egyptian gods. And each time, Moses offers a chance for Pharaoh to humble himself and to let the Israelites go. But after each plague, we're told that Pharaoh either hardened his heart or that his heart grew hard. He's doing this of his own will. And so eventually, it's with the second set of 5 plagues that we begin to hear how God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So the point of the story seems to be this. Even though God knew that Pharaoh would resist his will, God still offered him all of these chances to do the right thing. But eventually, Pharaoh's evil reaches a point of no return. I mean, even his own advisors think that he's lost his mind. And it's at that point that God takes over and bends Pharaoh's evil towards his own redemptive purposes. God lures Pharaoh into his own destruction as he saves his people, which is what happens next. With the final plague, it's the night of Passover, and God turns the tables on Pharaoh. Just as he killed the sons of the Israelites, so God will kill the firstborn in Egypt with a final plague. But unlike Pharaoh, God provides a means of escape through the blood of the Lamb. And here the story stops and introduces us in detail to the annual Israelite ritual of Passover. On the night before Israel left Egypt, they sacrificed a young, spotless lamb and painted its blood on the doorframe of their house. And when the divine plague came over Egypt, the houses covered with the blood of the lamb were passed over, and the sun spared. And so every year since, the Israelites have reenacted that night to remember and to celebrate God's justice and his mercy. But Pharaoh, because of his pride and rebellion, he loses his own son, and he's compelled to finally let the Israelites go free. And so the Israelite slaves make their exodus from Egypt. But no sooner do they leave than Pharaoh changes his mind, and he gathers his army and chases after the Israelites for a final showdown. As the Israelites pass through the waters of the sea safely, Pharaoh charges towards his own destruction. The Exodus story concludes with the first song of praise in the Bible. It's called the Song of the Sea. And the final line declares that the Lord reigns as king. And then the song retells in poetry what the story of God's kingdom is all about. It's about how God is on a mission to confront evil in his world and to redeem those who are enslaved to evil. God is going to bring his people into the promised land where his divine presence will live among them. This story is what it looks like when God becomes king over his people. So after the Israelites sing their song, the story takes a sharp turn. The Israelites are trekking through the wilderness on their way to Mount Sinai, and they're hungry, they're thirsty, and they start criticizing Moses and God for even rescuing them. They say they long for the good old days in Egypt. I mean, it's crazy. So God graciously provides food and water for Israel in the wilderness, but these stories, they cast a dark shadow. And we begin to wonder, could it be that Israel's heart is just as hard as Pharaoh's? We shall see. But for now, that's the first half of the book of Exodus.
So we've covered some of this already, but I'm going to highlight a few things from the story of Moses that you saw in overview in that video. So we last left off with Moses being raised in Pharaoh's palace and then growing up there. But of course he has two identities. He is Israelite, but also he has been raised Egyptian. So some trouble occurs and he ends up killing an Egyptian who was beating an Israelite slave. And so Moses has to flee to the wilderness. And he settles out there for what he thought was going to be a quiet life, tending sheep for his father-in-law Jethro. And then one of the most famous scenes in Old Testament literature occurs, the call of Moses and God appearing in the burning bush here in Exodus 3. I want you to, as an interpretive exercise, to read this passage. So go ahead and pause the video and read Exodus 3:1 through 4:17 and answer the following questions. What are Moses' objections to his call? There are several objections he gives. What are God's responses to these objections? And the question that we ask of all these stories, what do we learn about God in this story? And what do we learn about Moses and through Moses about humanity? So go ahead and pause the video now to complete this exercise. One of the most important things that happens in this call narrative of Moses is that God gives Moses God's name, God's personal name. One of Moses' objections was, well, what if I go to the Israelites and ask and talk to them about the God of your fathers? And they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? And God says to Moses, I am. Or I am who I am. That is what you say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. In the Hebrew grammatical structure of this word, I am, does not have tense like we have in English. It's not just the past or the future or the present, but it is all. It is the I am, I will be, and also a causative action, I cause to be. So it's really a great and deep name to talk about the God of Israel here. In Hebrew, the name here that God reveals is Yahweh, and it is written with the four capital letters, the four consonants of that Hebrew word, and we call that the tetragrammaton, the name of God, Yahweh. So Moses does accept his call after much objection, and after God promising that his brother will help him, and he goes to talk to Pharaoh. And here enters what we call a contest narrative. Really, we see the struggle between Moses and Pharaoh to get the Pharaoh to let the people go is also a struggle between Moses' God and the Egyptians' God. So you see that over and over again in the plagues and the various ways that Moses and Pharaoh interact. And the plagues, each one of them represents a challenge to each of the different Egyptian gods. So you have the Nile being turned to blood, the Nile water being turned to blood, basically as a challenge to the Nile River god. And then another challenge when the frogs come out of the Nile to that river god. The gnats come, and that's a challenge to the dust, the dirt of the ground, where there is a god for that as well. Flies come over the whole Egyptian land and the Egyptian people, and that is a challenge to the god of the air. The livestock all dies. And that is a challenge again to Egyptian God. The boils appear on people's skin. There's hail that destroys crop. Locust destroys fertility. All of these represent different areas that Egyptian gods are over. And then the great god, the sun god of Egypt, is challenged when there is a plague of darkness that covers all of the land where the Egyptians are living, but not where the Israelites are. And the 10th plague is the last one, the one that finally convinces Pharaoh to let the people go, and that is the death of the firstborn. Just as in the beginning, when Hebrew baby boys are thrown into the Nile River, now it's the firstborn of the Egyptians who die. And this is where we get the origin of the Jewish festival, still celebrated today, called Passover. It is a celebration that the Israelites today, the Jews, celebrate to remember how God saved them and redeemed them from the slavery in Egypt, and continues to redeem them. Then, this is a famous scene out of many movies, but then we see Moses leading the people out, and they cross over the Red Sea, or translations may be better translated as Sea of Reeds. And so we learn here that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea went back to its place. After he had opened up the sea and all the people went through, Moses made the water go back, and the Egyptians were swept into the sea. So not only does God provide a way out for the people, but he also rescues them from the Egyptians who are coming after them. We're not 100% sure about the path that Moses and the people in the wilderness took, but it does seem, that they crossed across some body of water. It may not have been the Red Sea, might have been the Sea of Reeds or another lake. They ended up wandering for a while, getting to Mount Sinai, finding there the Ten Commandments were given there. They camped out there, and then later ended up wandering again now for 40 years in the wilderness. So you kind of see the path they might have taken. In the end of Deuteronomy, we'll finally get to up into the land of Canaan, and you'll see up there by Jericho where they end up after the end of Deuteronomy. In the midst of their journey through the wilderness, God continues to provide for these people. The ones he's rescued, he gives them water from a rock. He gives them quail, and he gives them manna, because the Israelites were grumbling. They were complaining. They wanted to go back to Egypt. But here we see, even after God provided water for them, they're grumbling. And so the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. And as they went to pick up the bread in the morning, they called it manna, because manna in Hebrew means what is it, and they did not know what this bread was, this wafer. And Moses says, this is the bread the Lord is giving you to eat. So you see God providing for the people in the wilderness during their journey. We're going to end here and start at the next video.